Hey friends, welcome back to Heretical Hippies, where Anna and Carrie Jo wander back into the wreckage of their deconstruction to see if they can offer hope to anyone else who might be climbing out of the dust and ashes of their faith. Buckle up, it's about to get real. Hey people, we are here, Anna and myself. We are going to talk about prayer, then versus now. Anna, welcome.
Hey.
So, you are going to start us off. I think you have a couple definitions to share, and then you're going to describe your prayer life prior to deconstruction and then what it currently looks like. So, let's hear it.
Yeah, I pulled up it's funny, prayer is one of those things that, it looks vastly different based on your belief systems, right? You can obviously, we know what Catholics generally, they have the hand gestures, and they have the Latin liturgy, and there's all this really steeped in tradition on how they pray, and it's very formulaic in a
Mm-hmm.
way. And then you have on the other end of the spectrum, prayer that is so loose that there's no rules, right? And there's all in between. So, in general, a solemn request for help or expression of thanks addressed to God or an object of worship, an earnest hope or wish, a sacred act of communication with the holy, obviously found in all religions, and it may be corporate as a group or personal on an individual level, utilizing various forms and techniques, like I mentioned. Basically, a two-way conversation between you and the divine.
Mm-hmm.
In the case of a lot of people, that they call that God. You can call it whatever you want. I think it's just, in my personal experience, and in my Christian experience, it was a very real conversation. I was talking to a very real and personal God that I was also leaving space to hear back from. And hearing from God was essentially just waiting, giving that space in my thoughts and allowing for whatever was coming back in to be filtered through what how I understood his character to be, would be the
Mm-hmm.
filter. So if it came back where this voice in my head was saying, um, "Take off all your clothes and run down the street," I knew that wasn't. I would filter it, right?
Right,
I
right.
was like, "That's not God," right?
Intrusive thought alert.
Right, right. And then, but if the thought that came into my mind was, "You need to call your mom and tell her you love her," right? Then I'd be
Right.
like, "You know what? God is leading me to do this."
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of the formula that was going on in my mind. That's how I learned. And for a while, I was like, man, how do you hear God? Right? It's a common question within Christianity because most people don't hear an audible voice, right?
Right.
Uh, most people, most of the time throughout history, haven't heard an audible voice,
Right. There are very few accounts of this.
Right, right. So the prayer in and of itself was based on the understanding that God was personal and that he cared and wanted an active role in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And the actual interaction was mostly based on me and my filter. And the actual interpretation afterwards of how my prayer impacted my life was also continue to be subjective, right? Like, I asked God for this and I got it. I feel like it's important to caveat that I'd never really bought into this idea that that everything was God. That, when the wind blowed, yes, I could say that's God, but I didn't always think about it constantly like that. So,
Right.
like a lot of Christians, when it benefited me, it was hard for me not to interpret it as God is doing something as a result of my prayer.
That is really interesting. I wa I wanna add something. I've actually been thinking about this a lot with prayer. I, at this point, in my understanding, feel like prayer as taught within, let's say, conservative evangelicalism, because that's kind of, the lens that we're viewing things from, is kind of a smoke and mirrors show. Because if you look at probability and chance alone, if you're praying for such and such to happen, if there's any role that you can play in that, you're actively working toward that, right? I
Mhm.
mean, if you want to get a job promotion, you're working hard. You are showing to the boss that you're proving that you are a worthwhile candidate. All these things are coming into play, right? You pray for that promotion. Okay, so you get the promotion. Well, that doesn't mean God gave you the promotion. You were actively working towards that. So when I look at these kind of requests, these asking for things through prayer, like you said, the wind may blow and it might not mean anything, but if you needed something to be cooled off in that very moment and you prayed and that wind would blow your way, you would attribute that to an answered prayer,
Mhm.
previously. And
Sure.
I see prayer now in that way, that probability alone, some of your prayers are going to be answered. That's just the likelihood of
Right.
it.
Right.
And so, yeah, and I have a lot more deconstructing to do when it comes to prayer. It's still kind of a point of contention for me.
Mm.
But, yeah, it's interesting that when you said that about the wind, I thought, "Oh, yeah, that's, like, exactly what I've been thinking about." We justify it, we kind of, air quote, like, answer our own prayers in a way by working toward those things, or by looking for things that we want to attribute to God's action on our behalf.
Yeah. Yeah, I think another thing the dilemma that I kept coming up against in my prayer life was, the obvious praying for people in dire situations and not getting answers. So then
Yes.
recruiting more people to pray. Like, here's a prayer chain,
Right.
or let's go have intercessory prayer as a group, or let's fast and pray. So then it became, is there a formula to getting what we want? Like, if I stop eating, if I cut out sugar, if I stop sinning in this one way, if I'm more pleasing to God, if I can get more people to petition on my behalf or this person's behalf, then I can get what I want. It's kind of looking back on, there was a time where I started to, this was part of my deconstruction journey of questioning the rationale
Mhm.
of this way of thinking. Um, and then it got me really frustrated
Yes.
because, I was like, I had a friend, and like all of us, we pray for things throughout our life, whether it's close ones or personal issues that we long to see change in so bad. And we're willing to do almost whatever it takes. Like you said earlier, if the wind blows in the right direction at the right time, then obviously you're going to credit it to God. And then if it doesn't, then it's like it's kind of world shattering especially when it's a life or death situation, or um, something that you desire so badly, to see for something good to happen,
Right.
right? I'm
Right,
not
you're
just
not
asking to
praying to,
win the
like
lottery.
I was literally gonna say that same thing. Yes. Yes, there's a huge disconnect for me with the petitionary prayer and how things, quote, unquote, "seem to
Seem to
be
be answered.
answered" or not.
Yeah.
Just still to this day does not make sense to me, and it's interesting because I've looked back on my Christian journey and tried to identify various, maybe, moments of deconstruction, or I don't even wanna say that, but maybe, like, a whiff of it, like, I see a whiff of deconstruction there, because I would never really allow myself to go into that, but it's like something cropped up, and then I just, like, put it down again. But
Mm,
almost all of the things that I can identify in my 20-year plus journey has to do with prayer and the way God does or doesn't answer them. So it's
mm.
it's played a huge role in my deconstruction journey.
Can you tell me more about that story? That part of your life?
Which specifically, like,
Yeah.
some of those experiences?
Mhm.
Yeah, well, I think I even brought this up in when I shared my story on that episode of praying for a really good friend from college. She had a brain tumor, and I was believing with all my heart. I was praying with faith, believing that God was gonna do it. Heal her, obviously, is what I was praying for, and she died. And I remember thinking, what? Like, I was mustering all the faith I could. I was believing, I was, like, kind of forcing myself to believe that God was gonna do this, when in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, "Well, what if God doesn't? Like, what if it doesn't happen?" And so I just believed. I was just like, "Nope, nope, nope." I would squelch those little doubts, and I would just believe, try to muster it up. And
Mhm.
I did that for months, and then she died, and it just left me with a furrowed eyebrow because I thought, "What? What could I have done better?" I almost felt like it was kind of my fault. Like, why couldn't I convince God that this was a worthwhile request? I mean, she had just gotten married, like, maybe 6 months, or it was less than a year. She'd been married less than a year, and then she died, and I just couldn't make sense of how letting her die was good. She had her whole life ahead of her, and so that was the one major thing. It was kinda like that seed was planted, and I'll never forget it. I'll never forget it,
Yeah.
because I was part of a church at the time that I was in, like, a women's, like, a young women's, like, with younger kids kind of group, and one of the, what do I say, like, elder women, she was a little more charismatic. I mean, it wasn't a charismatic church, but she was a little more charismatic in the way she believed and talked about things, and she was kind of dismissive at my being so incredulous over this not being answered, and it it's like she was almost, like, saying, "Well, you didn't have enough, maybe you didn't have enough faith. Maybe it wasn't
Mhm.
enough." And it's like, Wait, what?" So now there's all these conditions to answered prayer, or, like, you have to tick all the right boxes, like you were mentioning earlier, maybe if I just fast a little longer or get rid of this sin issue in my life or something, and it was just pretty devastating and actually traumatizing that when I look back at it and think about how it has profoundly affected me. But I could
Yeah.
share countless stories too of our time in Nigeria, praying for
Mm.
healing for people, praying for, I don't know, somebody to stop being abused. Those things didn't happen, and I'm just like, "Really? Really, God? Like, that wasn't worth answering?" And I could never make sense of it, and I was doing a lot of kind of question controlling and just saying, "Well, his ways are higher." I was just using that rote thing. "I can't understand him, he's God. If he's a God I can understand, he's not worth worshiping," right? We've all heard these things, and I was
Mhm.
just tamping those things down, saying, "Nope, nope, nope, nope. I can't deal with that." And I couldn't ask or answer those questions at that time, but prayer, wow. I mean, I I'm a little salty.
Yeah.
It's clear, I obviously am, and it's fine. Like I said, I still have a lot to work through.
Yeah. Well, I think the I see this pattern within our deconstruction stories, as I'll speak for myself, that um where my world was, people use the analogy like an onion, you keep peeling back layers. And I kind of look at it like in the opposite, like on an onion, it's on the outside and then you peel it back and you keep getting to the center, right? Whereas, like, imagine it's the opposite where there's like a circle within a circle within a circle within a circle. And we're actually starting on the inside with the smallest circle. And our world is that little bitty circle, you
Mm.
know? And then there are things that pop the bubble of that circle. The bubble gets broken because we realize that it's too small. These are the type of experiences that broke those bubbles and expanded our pushed us outside to a bigger, a different, broader perspective on how things work. And then each time the bubble gets broken with scenarios like this that force us to think about things outside of the norm, that force us to address the whys and what ifs and hows, that cause us to dig deeper and seek more understanding. And then we start taking into account that and I think it gets so big, like we've talked about before, to where we go, I don't know, but I think that the trauma that you're talking about, when we're in those confined spaces, that feels like, wait a minute, it shouldn't be this, like this. It shouldn't work like this. And it's frustrating at the time because you just want to understand. But then you realize that the confinement is like slavery.
It feels like freedom to let go of that narrow understanding of things.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, like you're
Yeah.
saying, I love that. It's a beautiful visual of those bubbles bursting and your container widening. It's expanding for your experience to make sense of your experience. And I think that was something for me that was another disconnect within my evangelical experience is it did not allow for me to make sense of my human experiences within the system of belief. It was
Right.
always met with those, we can't understand God's ways. Or, well, that can't be possible because God isn't like that, or whatever dismissive gaslighting phrase you wanna use. There are
Mhm.
many, but and I did it to myself, like I just mentioned earlier. So, yeah, the expansion is what's beautiful, and I'm
Mhm.
grateful for it. Those experiences suck when I look back on them, and I think, my poor friend and her family, and that sucks. I'm grateful for the role that my perception of it played in widening my perspective and getting a bigger understanding of this human life experience.
Listen.
Yeah.
So I have a list of different quote unquote types of prayer that I experienced within my Christianity, a lot of which I no longer participate in, but some of them I do, and that's what we're talking about today, then versus now, right?
Yeah, let's hear your
Um,
then list.
so intercession for others, right? Obviously, we just discussed that a little bit. Another word is supplication, like asking for help. We're asking for help for other people. Confession, acknowledging our sin and confessing it. Adoration, a prayer, worship prayer. We see that a lot in the Psalms where they're, speaking out about how beautiful and awesome God is. And sometimes prayer would be just that, it would be just like, God, you're so good. Thank you for doing this, or thank you for doing that, or just
Mhm.
adoration. Speaking in tongues. I don't know if you grew up or around or experienced that very much, but I did, and it was
So you
very
had the
real.
experience of speaking in tongues?
I have. Um, I've experienced being in churches where everyone in the church speaks in tongues.
Wow.
I've been in churches where, it is, like in scripture and there's a formula to how you do it, and so someone needed to speak in tongues, and the pastor would allow for that person to speak, and then everybody would pause in the church and wait for an interpretation.
That's fascinating.
I've been in circles of people that mostly speak in tongues during intercessory prayer.
So
So
it doesn't
once
require, an interpretation then?
Right, great. Yeah. So they're just praying to intercede in a language that only God can understand, I guess.
Mhm.
And then of course healing prayer, which goes along with the petitionary, but sometimes we just lay hands on someone and we just speak healing over them. Scriptural, kind of repeating back to God who he is. And that kind of goes along with the worship as well and the praise. Mostly to center, I think. That was a centering type prayer and meditative type prayer. Those are all forms that I participated in. And I would say that in the group prayer that I had, there was the home churches that we were part of had a beautiful couple that kind of started the whole sisterhood of home churches. And we would have these little retreats that we'd go out somewhere and we'd talk and have teachings, but then we'd spend a great deal of time just praying. Like one time, this a woman she was wearing a necklace and she felt like God had told her in the time of prayer to give me the necklace. And it was a symbol of something. It actually had a couple of acorns and some oak leaves on it, and I had gotten during that same prayer session, I felt like God had told me that my husband and I were like oaks. And he had given me this whole image, and that's the painting that I painted.
Wow.
Um, but I got given this necklace, and so I kept the necklace. I don't have the painting, um, but I have the memory.
Yeah,
And
that's really cool.
there's some really, True Joe, I have some really, really cool stories throughout my lifetime where it's hard even now for me to look back on how prayer impacted a situation and not think that there was some type of divine intervention.
Mm,
There's a lot, I have way more stories that make me question than they
right.
do confirm.
Right.
But the ones that do confirm still linger in my heart and in my mind as what if?
Yes, and I feel like those experiences for me, if I had many of those experiences, which I have a few maybe, but I could categorize them as kind of being in a relationship with that. Like,
Mhm.
yeah, there are things we can't explain, we can't understand, but that's kind of the beauty of life, and I think we can genuinely call those miracles. You know, like,
Mhm.
it's not explainable. We don't know who did it, what did it, if there's a who or what, but it just happened, and yay, like, that's cool. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're very real experiences. I
Right.
have to share one with you
Yes,
because
yes,
it's
yes. I was gonna ask, but I didn't wanna put you on the spot.
yeah. So and this is probably one of the if not the most profound miraculous experience that I had ever had. So we had become friends with a gentleman that was challenging us to consider prayer as a very real active participation in an experience with God. And he encouraged us to do this experiment, which we did. I'll tell you. We sat down as a family. We had all five kids were still living at home. They were all little. I think they ranged in age from 6 to 17. There was a broad range. They were all young. And we sat down one day and we said, okay, kids, we're going to just do an experiment. It was a little bit scary because we'd never done anything like this before. And especially with our kids, let's drag our
Right.
kids into this
Yeah,
experiment.
exactly.
But they had traveled the country and been in lots of different situations, very experienced and I don't know, we felt like they could handle.
Mhm.
So we said, okay, what we're gonna do is we're gonna pray together. And we're gonna give each of you guys an index card with a pencil or pen. And we're just gonna ask God to join us. And then we're gonna ask him to tell us whatever he wants to tell us. We want to go on a journey with him today. So we're going to invite him to tell us what to do. And some people are probably listening to this right now going, what the fuck? You know, who the fuck are these people? You know?
I ask myself that all the time about me.
But it was so beautiful at the time. Looking back on it now, I realize how the potential for this to turn really bad, but in this situation, it didn't. It was really beautiful. So one of us got a word and that we were supposed to go to the mall. And so we wrote that down. We continue to pray. And then another kid in the group says, there's going to be somebody at the makeup store that's behind the counter, and she's a girl with blonde hair and purple shirt, and she needs to hear that God loves her.
Dang, that's specific.
Oh, it's very specific. So she wrote that down. That kid wrote that down. And then we continue to pray. And mostly it's just listening prayer at this
Mhm.
point. And another kid, so each kid got a specific person. We're talking about like my son, he knew there was a homeless man in a brown shirt and a brown hat that was going to be standing near the specific store that needed to hear that God loved him. And then that same son actually got a word that there were going to be two women walking out of the store in front of where those little toys that all the mechanical stuff that kids can get on at the
Yes.
mall.
Yeah. Petri
Like,
dishes.
right, exactly. There was going to be two women that walked out of the store near there with a white fluffy dog that needed to hear that God loved them. Like, super specific and
My
random too,
gosh.
because nobody took their dog to the mall.
Right.
At that time, it wasn't really like nobody did that. And each kid got at least one or two different situations that they felt like God was calling them to participate with him in. So we loaded up the kids in the car and we drove to the mall. And I kid you not, every single one of those situations occurred. Like, we showed up and we honestly, me and Ricky, our hearts were just pounding, because
Right.
we were like, what are we doing for kids?
Right.
Like, what are we setting them up for, right? But we also knew that, like, if God is who he says he is, then this should be a piece of cake for him.
Right. Exactly.
And yeah, we kind of just like reluctantly walked in the mall, like almost holding our breath, right?
Looking for a fire alarm.
Right,
Let me get out of
exactly. How
here.
can we? And I think it was my oldest daughter that was like, "Oh my gosh, there's that woman." She's at the makeup store and she's standing behind the counter and she's got blonde hair and she's got a purple shirt on and she's like, she runs up, and she goes, she's like, "What do I do?" And I'm like, "Well, what did God tell you to do?" And she's like, "Well, God told me to go tell her that he loves her." And I'm like, "Okay, then we'll stand right here and we'll wait for you to go do it. And we'll wait for you." And she went and did it, and she came back, and she was like, "Oh my gosh, that was so cool," like, I told her, and she would, like, listen to me, and she really needed to hear it, and it was so awesome, and I was like, "Oh, it's so cool." So, I kept walking, and the next thing you know, this kid sees this person over here they're supposed to talk to, and this kid sees this person over here, so Ricky and I eventually split up because our kids are going in different
Right.
directions, and we're trying to and the last one was the women walking out of the store by the toys with the dog, the white fluffy dog. And we were nervous about this. Like at this point, we were pretty blown away. We were like, we could leave now. Like we have
Right.
5 kids. All of them have had this unique experience. Even my son that saw the homeless man with the brown shirt and the brown hair or brown hat, that, like he totally saw that guy. It was just mind blowing. And so then we went to where the toys were, we stood there, and we kinda waited, we were like, "Huh, nothing's happening," and, we kinda sit down and couch end up Ricky's like, "Well," in his play he's such a kid at heart, he's like, "Let's just play on the toys."
Right.
So, we started playing around, and then all of a sudden, Gremlin goes, "There!"
Oh
And I was like,
my
"What?"
gosh.
And I turned and looked, and there were 2 old ladies walking out of JCPenney's with a white fluffy dog. And I was like, "Oh." And at this point, all of my fear of walking up to people had completely gone away because I was like,
Yeah.
clearly God is doing this, right? So we walked up to them, and Graylin in his cute, adorable little, he had this curly afro and he was just so adorable and so full of faith. And he told them what God had told him. And they just thought he was the cutest thing in the world. And we ended up, our whole entire family ended up laying hands on them and praying for them. And then everybody went about their day like normal, right? And we left the mall just in awe of what had just happened and a little baffled, wondering what does this mean
Mhm.
for tomorrow? You know?
Right. What do I do with this information moving forward?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. That is mind-blowing. It does leave you scratching your head. Like,
It
I
does.
was literally just scratching my head thinking, "Holy shit." Like,
Right. So
yeah.
probability definitely plays a part. Sure. Can you happen to run into somebody at the mall with a purple shirt and blonde hair? Absolutely. Right. Can you happen to find a homeless guy near the mall that's probably wearing brown? Yeah, sure. Right. But all of those things together at the same time,
Right.
and then sometimes so specific that it seems so far fetched that it would happen in the first place. It just made it hard for not us not to consider whether we really believed that God was with us that day.
Mhm.
And I also, in the world of prayer, is pretty much almost whatever you want it to be?
Yeah, and that's exactly like, you'll hear my list. That's exactly what I'm finding, that I, at one point, thought, "I just don't pray anymore." And that's not true. That's never been true. I do pray, just it takes on very different forms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear your list.
Do you wanna talk about your current, like, now? You talked a lot about
No, I
then,
want to
but
hear your then first.
you wanna hear my then? Okay, here we go.
Mhm.
I gotta get my note up on my phone. Okay, so I just made, like, a list of kind of descriptive, like, what it looked like, how I engage with prayer. So, pre-deconstruction, I prayed about specific details, and I mean, maybe I'll give examples here and there, but there's too many. I won't give an example for everything. But I mean, you can understand what that is. I prayed about specific details, like the date and time of something, or like, when I went into labor or stuff like that, right? I begged for healing, both miraculous and small. And this is also another huge source of contention for me with prayer and healing prayer specifically, because I'm a type 1 diabetic. It doesn't really interfere with my life. I mean, yeah, it's something I have to deal with, but some people put contacts in the morning. I deal with a pump and a sensor, no big deal, right? So it doesn't really negatively affect my life, but I was challenged so many times personally, like not challenged by other people, but I personally felt like I need to ask for healing, because what if God wants to heal me of that? And so like I would struggle so much, like, do I even bother praying for that? Because it's not really a big deal to me. And there are other people who need more miraculous healings? So that was an interesting kind of back and forth for me with God. Like I would constantly get mad at God for believing in faith. Again, this keeps coming up, believing in faith, like mustering that faith, believing that he has the power to heal, and then he doesn't heal me. So it's like, well, I didn't do the right, hula hoop dance for you. Like I don't know. It was just so confusing. So that was something I did then. I also faithfully brought other people's requests to God. I mean, there are a lot of people who look at people who deconstruct and say, well, they were just never really true believers. I don't know if you've heard that or not.
Mhm.
Um, but I don't think I've heard that personally, but I'm sure it's been or is being said about me, and that's fine. People can think that, but it's like if they knew me at all, if they were close enough to me to understand how I operated in my faith system, they would know that I was hardcore sold out. I was a prayer warrior, to use some
Mhm.
Christianese, prayed faithfully for other people. I asked for good things for myself and for others. Like you said, I wasn't asking to win the lottery. I wasn't asking, for selfish things. I was asking for very good things. I begged for protection for myself, my family, especially while living in Nigeria. There was a lot of civil unrest, church bombings every Sunday for a while, bombings at the marketplace. I mean, there are stories after story like that I could share, which it's not worth it right now, but begged for protection. And it didn't always happen. But sometimes it did, or it appeared to have happened. I asked for wisdom and direction in the vast majority of decisions I made. Maybe not the small ones, like not what I'm gonna wear today. I wasn't that extreme. I was somewhere within the range of normal, I feel like.
Mhm.
One is actually really hard to admit, but it's true. I would beg for Jesus to return when life got really hard, because I
Mm.
was like, "Fuck this." I mean, I wasn't thinking that or saying that. I say that now. I was like, "Fuck this, I'm over it, like, Jesus, come back, like, can we just call it? Let's just unplug, we're
Mhm.
done."
Mhm.
And that is such a dismissive way to live and such an escape mechanism, and it wasn't healthy when I look back on that. Like I said, I was fervent. I equated answered prayers with being blessed or favored, like I was somehow in God's good graces, or he was pleased with me, or I was doing something right, or deserved, the answered prayer. But I also saw unanswered prayers as a betrayal of what was good, because like I said, I was praying for good things. And then God didn't bring those good things to people or to myself. And it's like, what the hell, man? And how do you know? Like, it was like I wasn't doing something right, or I wasn't asking for the right things, because there's this whole caveat of, he will give you whatever you ask for if it's according to his will. Well, then there's another gaslighting phrase, because you ask for these good things, it doesn't happen, and then you can gaslight yourself, or other people will say it for you. Well, it's just not within God's will. That wasn't what his plan was for you or for Joe Schmo or whatever. And I hated that so much. It's like, well, then how on earth can you tell what God's will is? Like, there's literally no way of knowing, because what I perceive as good, clearly, God didn't want it to happen, because it didn't happen. So, I
Mhm.
was kinda at a certain point, like, after so much repetition of that over years and years and years, I finally was getting to the point where it's like, I don't does it even really matter? I think I was kinda going off on prayer over the time, because it just wasn't adding up with my experience.
Mhm.
And then let's see. Okay, I'm guilty of asking God to make something happen or to change something when I could have been taking steps toward those ends. Not always. Like we were talking about earlier how when you pray for something, you're generally working toward that end or desiring that, so you're doing whatever you can. But sometimes I wasn't doing what I could have done. I was just like, "Well, it's in your hands, God. You can do it. I'll leave it to you." And then I just sit back and watch. And that's such a cop out for taking control of whatever you can control in your life.
Mhm.
Um, and then very lastly, to kind of sum up my entire experience with prayer before deconstruction, I would say I treated God like a cosmic vending machine. If I put the quarters in and I push the button, that should come out. Um, it's still a source of contention for me, but I
So
enjoy
when
my
you
prayer now. I really do enjoy what prayer looks like for now. But yeah, go ahead. What were you gonna ask?
what is the source of contention for you?
That like everything I described of how I prayed then and all the kinda hangups that came with it mostly I can relate it back to what I was being told God was like, or,
Mm,
like that gaslighting phrase of, "Well, it wasn't within God's will."
listen,
And I couldn't make sense of healing my friend of brain cancer not being in God's will. How was
listen,
it better for her to perish in pain? You
listen.
know, and then again, you're gaslit into believing, well, he needed her in heaven more than we needed her here. I mean, all these bullshit answers that people give to to ease pain or discomfort or attempt to ease pain or discomfort. It just created more contention within me of the system, and I air quote system, the system of prayer. And everybody's experience with prayer is going to be different based on what religious tradition they were raised in, how they were taught, how it was um, portrayed to them through example. A lot of what I learned in prayer, I learned by praying with other people. Oh,
Right,
this is how you pray for something. Oh, that's how you specifically ask for, God to be in the details of something. It's really like it's a cultural thing that's passed down with whatever circle you find yourself in.
right.
So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah, I think the it sounds like it was, just so frustrating to be told that well, frustrating to be told that God cared about your personal life that much and to find out that he doesn't.
right, in my experience, I was being told that, but in the way I was experiencing things, it was like, "Well, that doesn't add up."
And
That's
then when he doesn't, then there's excuses made for him.
exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly, and that was just infuriating and
So
could never wrap my head around it, which is
no, it's
interesting
true.
because I never when I look at my Christian experience, there were very few things that I would question or, like, actively have kind of conflicting thoughts about. I was able to gaslight myself and explain things away based on these other, ways I was being taught to do that. But when it
Mhm.
came to prayer, it was such a passion of mine. It was such a source of air quote connection with divine that I found to be valuable on some level, yet it wasn't living up to what it was portrayed that it should be. And so
Right.
that was it was like a constant drip on my forehead, like just over and
Mhm.
over and over. I just kept getting these negative feedback loops from it. And that yeah, so like I'm still kind of working through the trauma of that, but it's okay. That's part of the healing process.
Absolutely. So, I'd love to hear what prayer looks like for you now.
Yeah. Now I'm giving like really specifics because that's kind of how I approached the then list.
Mhm.
For me, my breath is prayer. I often bring my attention back to my breath and I may manipulate it or not, but even just noticing the breath, I feel like an interconnectedness and that's such a beautiful space of peace and like you said before centering. Even in my highly Christian days, I have found enjoying diverse foods as an act of prayer or worship even if you wanna it could be a little of both. I love the diversity in cultures and cuisines, and I love food, so um,
Wow.
it just yes, I remember, like, saying to my kids, because every moment's a teachable moment when you're in a Christian household, but I
Right.
stick by this, I genuinely do, that I would like Indian food, I would say, "Oh, I'm so thankful to God that he gave such creativity with spices and how to cook things and how to prepare things that these other cultures do things very differently from, my own culture, and I get to experience that, I get to enjoy that, and I perceive that as a divine gift, and, um, I some days I don't believe in a God, some days I think there might be, but when it comes to food, I'm kinda like, "Yeah, okay, I think there is," because food is, like, such a pleasurable kind of transcendent experience for me, and
Um,
I don't know that I have any more words to really articulate that, but it speaks to me, like, on a deeper level than just, "This tastes good." So, I mean, it's that's weird, like, people are like, "Holy shit, this girl needs therapy." Well, I don't disagree. I am in therapy, so don't worry about it, but, yeah, so enjoying food and then also physical movement is prayer for me, so running, walking, dancing, doing yoga, going to dive practice, physical pleasurable experiences, and it's not like I'm acknowledging any form of divinity, it's just it's a beautiful part of the human experience, and I feel like anything that brings joy or life has got to be a form of prayer. It has to be. For me, that's kind of how I'm reframing these things.
it's almost like life is prayer.
Exactly, like, honestly, I could put almost anything under the prayer
Right.
category for me now, which is ironic because in my Christian day, that pray without ceasing, I was
Uh-huh.
so bothered by that. I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I suck at this." 'Cause, like, you only think to pray for somebody when they come to your mind, or, like, maybe you're at a stoplight and you've got a minute to kind of not think about much and something pops in your head and you pray. But I would beat myself up over that thinking, "I don't know how to pray without ceasing. I'm so easily distracted. I'm so" and then I would just make that excuse, "Well, I'm sinful," like, "God forgives that. I can't live up." Just, basically putting myself down to make up for the fact that I literally cannot pray without ceasing. And all the while, now, knowing what I do, I think we are literally praying without ceasing as we live our life.
Mhm.
And it's so funny to me how a lot of those Christian teachings, which I couldn't make sense of at the time, I'm outside of that Christian way of thought, and now I look at it and I'm like, yeah, like, whether you think God is real or not, it's a prayer all day long. Like, you're engaging with this beautiful thing of life, and it's so profound to kind of repurpose, I guess, this construct of prayer and have it make sense for you in a very different paradigm, I guess. Like, my paradigm
Yeah.
has shifted so greatly that I can now see.
Yeah.
And I think that's cool. Like, I had a light bulb moment about that several months ago, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, I'm doing it." I am actually praying without ceasing. Not that I give a fuck about that anymore, but it's like,
Uh-huh.
it's like
Yeah.
just fascinating to think, "Wow, okay." Like, you reframe it and it makes more sense.
Right. No, it's all a matter of perspective.
Mhm.
Yeah, and when I talk to, you know, um, my husband about this, he's like, he doesn't pray like verbally the way that he used to, and his idea of prayer is so ingrained in his mind as being a specific thing in a specific way, in a specific style and everything.
Right.
And we're both learning, and I have been learning to think outside of that box. Like we were talking earlier, that the my bubble is getting bigger. And um it's beautiful to think of life being a prayer. And then it does make sense that every your food, your choices, everything you're doing is an interaction with the divine, the holy, the sacred, because we're a ball of dirt flying through what's called an inner universe. We have no idea how we got here
Yeah.
or how that got there or whatever came before that got there. Like the fact that we exist is such a miracle.
Right.
Why not call it all divine?
Yeah, the line grows fuzzier and fuzzier as you start to try to actually categorize like sacred versus secular, right?
Listen,
It really all it all bleeds in. It's all the one and the same.
right?
It's all sacred. It's all secular. It's all that at the same time. It's
Yeah,
that again, that dualistic thinking that we try so hard to create binaries and it just doesn't work. We need to
yeah,
leave space and hold space for that tension of lots of gray area, lots of
right.
overlap, lots of I don't know. And
Yeah,
again, that's beautiful. So
yeah.
anyway, yeah, like my prayer life has changed drastically. And I've got a few more on my list. I'm just gonna run through like some of them are super self-explanatory. Um, but I think being playful and learning is prayer. Speaking gratitude to the wind, trees, birds, whatever is bringing me joy in that moment for their existence. Um, I feel very connected to birds. I've mentioned that before, but like when they're singing their song, it is such a beautiful reminder that they're not trying to be anything. They're just being what they are. They're being a bird, they're singing their song, and it's beautiful and it's joy inducing. And it's a reminder for me that I don't have to try to be anybody or anything. I just move through the world as who I am, and I'm bringing joy to people like that bird does. I may not know
Mhm.
it, they may not express it, but it's happening. And so it, like, just gives me freedom and space to not try so hard, to just be me. I this is huge. This was huge for me because I was such a prayer warrior. I turn, air quote, requests into gratitude. So I'll give a very specific example. When my middle kid got his license and started driving about a year ago, I was concerned for his safety because he would drive like 35 minutes one way to dive practice and then drive back. And it's on a really busy highway. It's like really crazy driving. People here cannot drive, just FYI. If you're coming to Naples, it is insane. And I normally would beg and plead for protection, right? God protect Clay as he drives, give him the awareness to make good decisions driving, blah, 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 all that stuff. But I stopped believing that God could do that. And so I would turn that into gratitude. Like I would be grateful that Clay has had good training, that I'm confident, in his ability to make the right choices, that he's a smart kid. And those are the things that are going to get him there safely. So that was huge for me because I would come up against these situations where I want to pray for God to manipulate something or to change something. And I just started reframing them and turning them into gratitude. Like, I'm so thankful that Clay did really well in his, driving experience, learning and all that. Yeah. And then, okay, I'll just blast through these next ones. Mindfulness and meditation, connecting with myself through that, being present for me is prayer, just like kind of enjoying the nectar of life with the people I'm around or just by myself, taking a bath. That has always been a huge kind of restorative practice for me, even before I kind of reframed prayer. Lighting a candle or incense, there's something sacred about that. There's something I that's deeply profound in meaning that I really enjoy. And then this is the last one. I'll wrap it up with this, but I actually thank my nervous system for trying to keep me safe when anxiety comes around. Like it'd be really natural to be like, "Oh, I'm feeling anxious again. I hate this. I hate this so much." Well, that just adds the anxiety. And so
Mhm.
I notice the anxious feeling, I acknowledge it, and I say to myself, "Thank you. Thank you so much for trying and working so hard to keep me safe. I appreciate that." And it kind of like lightens it a little bit, but it's also a form of gratitude prayer. So anyway,
It's beautiful. I love it. Like you're honoring the system that you put that's been put in place for you that you had no part in, you know?
yes,
And
exactly.
you really have no control over to some degree. I mean, obviously there's diet and practices that, therapy and so forth that we can come alongside our nervous system.
Right.
Right?
Right, work
But
in
the nervous
tandem
system
with.
is there,
Yes.
right? And it's
Yes.
doing its thing. And that's such a cool analogy of how you've approached prayer in general, really, because you're looking at these sacred gifts that have been given to you and you're choosing to work with them instead of against them by
Mhm.
honoring them and then agreeing with the good work that they're intended to do.
Even if I don't like it, I don't like it when anxiety comes, but it is part of a system that's built to protect me, and that's amazing, and I'm super thankful for that. I'd probably
Yeah.
be dead in a ditch somewhere if I didn't have my nervous system.
I love that. It's so awesome. I love that life is prayer. I
Mhm.
just love that. It's like even as we're talking right now, you can perceive it as prayer because our goal is to love and to fuel life and to be free, right? This is
Yes.
what we're doing. This is like our prayer to the world in a way.
And it's so expansive when you start reframing prayer, because when I experienced prayer prior to, my new understanding, it was very small. It was just a conversation between me and a higher being, asking for things, praising, thanking. Did you ever do that ACTS prayer, the ACTS? It was like
I think I know what you're talking
admiration,
about. Yeah,
confession,
yeah.
thanksgiving, and supplication. Like, I
Right,
would
right.
go through that. Like, it's literally a formula. It is
Mm.
exactly that. And, like, to think that that's what prayer was, and that's why I couldn't reconcile the pray without ceasing. I was like, "Well, I cannot do that. I cannot drive and do that at the same time if you want me to get to where I'm going safely." Um, but to understand this more expansive nature of prayer, it's a beautiful way to exist, and I'm super thankful for my new understanding of prayer and just kind of turning more and more things into a sacrament, and to me, that's a beautiful way to live.
St. Francis of Assisi had that same way or mode of operating. His prayer, he believed, it was without end because it was life. And I remember very little about what I've read, but one of the things that comes to mind was I remember him talking about even just washing the dishes was an act of prayer for him because he lived with monks in a monastery and they had chores to do. And so when they did their chores, that was their act of prayer as well. Everything they did was an act of prayer. And so their life is, they perceive that indeed these monks perceived their lives as prayers. I can too,
Exactly.
right?
It's not some unattainable thing for us common
Right,
folk.
right. It's all in our perspective.
And I love
So
how my perspective has shifted, and I'm hopeful that the listener, that you have been challenged in some way to view prayer in a very different way. Anna, is there anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
no, I can relate to all the things that you shared about what prayer looks like for you now. It's speaking truth and goodness. I did want to share one more thing. I'm sure some people that have heard about or maybe learned about the science. It's some people call it pseudoscience, but there is actual research on the power of the tongue. So there's a scientist. I think his name was Emont or something. He was a Japanese man. So the hypothesis that he had was that water treated with intention can affect the ice crystals formed from the water was and it was pilot tested under a double blind condition in the group of approximately 2,000 people in Tokyo focused positive intentions towards their water samples located inside an electromagnetically shielded room in California. That group was unaware of similar water samples set aside in a different location as controls. Ice crystals formed from both sets of water samples were blindly identified and photographed by an analyst, and the resulting images were blindly assessed for aesthetic appeal by 100 independent judges. Results indicated that crystals from the treated water were given higher scores of aesthetic appeal than those from the control water, lending support to the hypothesis that their words over this water actually affected how they were crystallized. And then some people call that, pseudoscience because there's more research that would need to be done to support it more in a more sound way. But there's other research that shows that speaking nicely to plants will support their growth, whereas yelling at them will not support their growth.
Go figure.
Right? Rather than the meaning of the words themselves, however, this may have more to do with the vibrations or the
Mm,
volume that the plant is feeling. So the plant reacts favorably to low levels of vibration. And then it gives the hertz and everything that are ideal. having said all of that, and also having come from a background where the tongue has the power of life and death,
Mm-hmm.
and that the mouth has the ability to speak wisdom and righteousness and justice, and it also has the power to speak evil. And so it can affect the whole body. You know how stress and the lack of stress affects our entire being, right? So you,
Yes.
you start going down this rabbit hole of frequency and how that affects our environment, how even inanimate objects affect our environment because of the frequency that comes off of them, um, is huge. That has greatly influenced my perspective on what prayer is
Mm.
and what vibration do I want to give my environment. And that usually, comes in many forms, whereas meditation, speaking truth and goodness, journaling thoughts and hopes and dreams, keeping in my mind a mantra to center and calm myself, reminding others and myself of their own beauty and strength. And especially, I believe in the power of laying on of hands. That was a big deal in prayer as well. And in my former understanding of it, but it continues to be where when among close friends and family, I allow myself to lay hands on or to hug them while I'm speaking truth, or confirming something in their life that they need to hear. This is kind of some of the examples of what prayer looks like for me now. So it's a beautiful thing. I love talking about this. I love sharing the possibilities of our impact on the world around us in as simple ways, even as, you ever walked into the room and you can tell immediately that mom's mad without
Oh
her saying
yeah.
a word,
It's a
right?
whole vibe.
Right, right.
Literally.
Exactly. Without even seeing her face, sometimes people say the tension is palpable, right?
Yes. Yes.
And I've even walked up to people, complete strangers, and thought to myself, I know this person when I clearly don't. Like I felt like a connection with them without ever having said a word or really knowing anything about them, right? Because and sometimes I think you and I had that when we first met
I was
each
gonna
other.
say we totally had that.
Yeah. I remember thinking to myself, I feel like I was either related to this person in a former life
Yes.
or something because we immediately connected. It
Yeah.
was like our vibrations were matched,
Right.
right? And it was
I
really,
have
really
goosebumps
cool.
on my head right now. But it's true. It's so true. You meet people and it is like a frequency thing. It's like, you can look these things up on YouTube too. Like you need a tuning fork and they'll hang a ping pong ball from a string and it'll be resting against the side of a tuning fork. If you hit a tuning fork of a different frequency, nothing happens. Okay, there's two different tuning forks, right? If you use a tuning fork that is the same frequency as the one that's touching the ping pong ball and you strike the isolated tuning fork, not touching the ping pong ball, if you strike that one, the other one will start resonating and the ping pong ball will start bouncing. It's the ball is just, so you can see it. So it's a visual thing. But
Right.
that is actually what happens with people and their frequencies and vibrations. And that sounds super new agey and whatever. And it probably is. It's considered that, but it's an actual thing. And
There's science to back up what we're talking about.
yes,
Now,
like
I mean,
it's
there's
a
science
little
to back
far
up
out
all kinds
there.
of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah,
And some people might call it pseudoscience,
it's
but
challenging for some people, but indeed, you can connect deeply with people, and that to me is another prayer. That is prayer. Like you're vibing together. You know, all cliches and whatever pop culture references aside, you are
right.
vibing with one another, and that is beautiful.
It is.
Prayer and life is beautiful. Oh, Anna, that was awesome. I think we could talk probably for another hour about that. Thanks for sharing how things have shifted for you. Thanks for listening to my story as well. If any of you have questions, please reach out. Even curiosities. If we said something that you're like, oh, I'd love to hear more about your experience with that, we are so open to converse with you. We know it's a huge important part of the journey, understanding each other's stories and feeling less alone. So we love y'all. We'll see you next time. Peace out, MFers. Well, friends, that wraps up this heretical episode. Thanks for listening, and be sure to rate and review our podcast and share with anyone who would be encouraged. See you next time.